Quantify the depth of every activity. An advantage of scheduling your day is that you can determine how much time you're actually spending in shallow activities. Extracting this insight from your schedules, however, can become tricky in practice, as it's not always clear exactly how shallow you should consider a given task. To expand on this challenge, let's start by reminding ourselves of the formal definition of shallow work that I introduced in the introduction. Shallow work, non-cognitively demanding, logistical-style tasks, often performed while distracted. These efforts tend not to create much new value in the world and are easy to replicate. Some activities clearly satisfy this definition. Checking email, for example, or scheduling a conference call is unquestionably shallow in nature. But the classification of other activities can be more ambiguous. Consider the following tasks. Example number 1. Editing a draft of an academic article that you and a collaborator will soon submit to a journal. Example number 2. Building a PowerPoint presentation about this quarter's sales figures. Example number 3. Attending a meeting to discuss the current status of an important project and to agree on the next steps. It's not obvious at first how to categorize these examples. The first two describe tasks that can be quite demanding, and the final example seems important to advance a key work objective. The purpose of this strategy is to give you an accurate metric for resolving such ambiguity, providing you with a way to make clear and consistent decisions about where given work tasks fall on the shallow to deep scale. To do so, it asks that you evaluate activities by asking a simple but surprisingly illuminating question. How long would it take, in months, to train a smart, recent college graduate with no specialized training in my field to complete this task? To illustrate this approach, let's apply this question to our examples of ambiguous tasks. Analyzing example number 1. To properly edit an academic paper requires that you understand the nuances of the work, so you can make sure it's being described precisely, and the nuances of the broader literature, so you can make sure it's being cited properly. These requirements require cutting-edge knowledge of an academic field, a task that in the age of specialization takes years of diligent study at the graduate level and beyond. When it comes to this example, the answer to our question would therefore be quite large, perhaps on the scale of 50 to 75 months. Analyzing example number 2. The second example doesn't fare so well by this analysis. To create a PowerPoint presentation that describes your quarterly sales requires 3 things. First, knowledge of how to make a PowerPoint presentation. Second, an understanding of the standard format of these quarterly performance presentations within your organization. And third, an understanding of what sales metrics your organization tracks and how to convert them into the right graphs. The hypothetical college graduate imagined by our question, we can assume, would already know how to use PowerPoint. And learning the standard format for your organization's presentations shouldn't require more than a week. The real question, therefore, is how long it takes a bright college graduate to understand the metrics you track, where to find the results, and how to clean those up and translate them into graphs and charts that are appropriate for a slide presentation. This isn't a trivial task, but for a bright college grad, it wouldn't require more than an additional month or so of training, so we can use 2 months as our conservative answer. Analyzing example number 3. Meetings can be tricky to analyze. They can seem tedious at times, but they're often also presented as playing a key role in your organization's most important activities. The method presented here helps cut through this veneer. How long would it take to train a bright, recent college graduate to take your place in a planning meeting? He or she would have to understand the project well enough to know its milestones and the skills of its participants. Our hypothetical grad might also need some insight into the interpersonal dynamics and the reality of how such projects are executed at the organization. At this point, you might wonder if this college grad would also need a deep expertise in the topic tackled by the project. For a planning meeting, probably not. Such meetings rarely dive into substantive content and tend to feature a lot of small talk and posturing, in which participants try to make it seem like they're committing to a lot without actually having to commit. Give a bright recent graduate 3 months to learn the ropes, and he or she could take your place without issue in such a gabfest. So we'll use 3 months as our answer. This question is meant as a thought experiment. I'm not going to ask you to actually hire a recent college graduate to take over tasks that score low, but the answers it provides will help you objectively quantify the shallowness or depth of various activities. If our hypothetical college graduate requires many months of training to replicate a task, then this indicates that the task leverages hard-won expertise. As argued earlier, tasks that leverage your expertise tend to be deep tasks, and they can therefore provide a double benefit. They return more value per time spent, and they stretch your abilities, leading to improvement. On the other hand, a task that our hypothetical college graduate can pick up quickly is one that does not leverage expertise, and therefore it can be understood as shallow. What should you do with this strategy? Once you know where your activities fall on the deep to shallow scale, bias your time toward the former. When we consider our case studies, for example, we see that the first task is something that you would want to prioritize as a good use of time, while the second and third are activities of a type that should be minimized. They might feel productive, but their return on time investment is measly. Of course, how one biases away from shallow and toward depth is not always obvious, even after you know how to accurately label your commitments. This brings us to the strategies that follow, which will provide specific guidance on how to accomplish this tricky goal. Ask your boss for a shallow work budget. Here's an important question that's rarely asked. What percentage of my time should be spent on shallow work? This strategy suggests that you ask it. If you have a boss, in other words, have a conversation about this question. You'll probably have to first define for him or her what shallow and deep work means. If you work for yourself, ask yourself this question. In both cases, settle on a specific answer. Then, and this is the important part, try to stick to this budget. The strategies that precede and follow this one will help you achieve this goal. For most people in most non-entry-level knowledge work jobs, the answer to the question will be somewhere in the 30 to 50% range. There's a psychological distaste surrounding the idea of spending the majority of your time on unskilled tasks, so 50% is a natural upper limit, while at the same time, most bosses will begin to worry that if this percentage gets too much lower than 30%, you'll be reduced to a knowledge work hermit who thinks big thoughts but never responds to emails. Obeying this budget will likely require changes to your behavior. You'll almost certainly end up forced into saying no to projects that seem infused with shallowness, while also more aggressively reducing the amount of shallowness in your existing projects. This budget might lead you to drop the need for a weekly status meeting in preference for results-driven reporting. Let me know when you've made significant progress, then we'll talk. It might also lead you to start spending more mornings in communication isolation, or decide it's not as important as you once thought to respond quickly and in detail to every CC'd email that crosses your inbox. These changes are all positive for your quest to make deep work central to your working life. On the one hand, they don't ask you to abandon your core shallow obligations, a move that would cause problems and resentment, as you're still spending a lot of time on such efforts. On the other hand, they do force you to place a hard limit on the amount of less urgent obligations you allow to slip insidiously into your schedule. This limit frees up space for significant amounts of deep effort on a consistent basis. The reason why these decisions should start with a conversation with your boss is that this agreement establishes implicit support from your workplace. If you work for someone else, this strategy provides cover when you turn down an obligation or restructure a project to minimize shallowness. You can justify the move because it's necessary for you to hit your prescribed target mix of work types. As I discussed in Chapter 2, part of the reason shallow work persists in large quantities in knowledge work is that we rarely see the total impact of such efforts on our schedules. We instead tend to evaluate these behaviors one by one in the moment, a perspective from which each task can seem quite reasonable and convenient. The tools from earlier in this rule, however, allow you to make this impact explicit. You can now confidently say to your boss, "This is the exact percentage of my time spent last week on shallow work," and force him or her to give explicit approval for that ratio. Faced with these numbers and the economic reality they clarify, it's incredibly wasteful, for example, to pay a highly trained professional to send email messages and attend meetings for 30 hours a week. A boss will be led to the natural conclusion that you need to say no to some things and to streamline others, even if this makes life less convenient for the boss or for you or for your coworkers. Because, of course, in the end, a business's goal is to generate value, not to make sure its employees' lives are as easy as possible. If you work for yourself, this exercise will force you to confront the reality of how little time in your busy schedule you're actually producing value. These hard numbers will provide you the confidence needed to start scaling back on the shallow activities that are sapping your time. Without these numbers, it's difficult for an entrepreneur to say no to any opportunity that might generate some positive return. I have to be on Twitter. I have to maintain an active Facebook presence. I have to tweak the widgets on my blog, you tell yourself, because when considered in isolation, to say no to any one of these activities seems like you're being lazy. By instead picking and sticking with a shallow to deep ratio, you can replace this guilt-driven unconditional acceptance with the more healthy habit of trying to get the most out of the time you put aside for shallow work, therefore still exposing yourself to many opportunities, but keeping these efforts constrained to a small enough fraction of your time and attention to enable the deep work that ultimately drives your business forward. Of course, there's always the possibility that when you ask this question, the answer is stark. No boss will explicitly answer, 100% of your time should be shallow, unless you're entry level at which point you need to delay this exercise until you've built enough skills to add deep efforts to your official work responsibilities. But a boss might reply in so many words, "As much shallow work is needed for you to promptly do whatever we need from you at the moment." In this case, the answer is still useful, as it tells you that this isn't a job that supports deep work, and a job that doesn't support deep work is not a job that can help you succeed in our current information economy. You should, in this case, thank the boss for the feedback, and then promptly start planning how you can transition into a new position that values depth. Finish your work by 5:30. In the 7 days preceding my first writing these words, I participated in 65 different email conversations. Among these 65 conversations, I sent exactly 5 emails after 5:30 p.m. The immediate story told by these statistics is that, with few exceptions, I don't send emails after 5:30. But given how intertwined email has become with work in general, there's a more surprising reality hinted by this behavior. I don't work after 5:30 p.m. I call this commitment fixed schedule productivity, as I fix the firm goal of not working past a certain time, then work backward to find productivity strategies that allow me to satisfy this declaration. I've practiced fixed schedule productivity happily for more than half a decade now, and it's been crucial to my efforts to build a productive professional life centered on deep work. In the sections ahead, I will try to convince you to adopt this strategy as well. Let me start my pitch for fixed schedule productivity by first noting that, according to conventional wisdom, in the academic world I inhabit, this tactic should fail. Professors, especially junior professors, are notorious for adopting grueling schedules that extend into the night and through weekends. Consider, for example, a blog post published by a young computer science professor whom I'll call Tom. In this post, which Tom wrote in the winter of 2014, he replicates his schedule for a recent day in which he spent 12 hours at his office. This schedule includes 5 different meetings and 3 hours of administrative tasks, which he describes as tending to bushels of emails, filling out bureaucratic forms, organizing meeting notes, planning future meetings. By his estimation, he spent only 1.5 out of 12 total hours sitting in his office tackling real work, which he defines as efforts that make progress toward a research deliverable. It's no wonder that Tom feels coerced into working well beyond the standard workday. "I've already accepted the reality that I'll be working on weekends," he concludes in another post. Very few junior faculty can avoid such a fate. And yet, I have. Even though I don't work at night and rarely work on weekends, between arriving at Georgetown in the fall of 2011 and beginning work on this chapter in the fall of 2014, I've published somewhere around 20 peer-reviewed articles. I also won 2 competitive grants, published 1 non-academic book, and have almost finished writing another, which you're listening to at the moment, all while avoiding the grueling schedules deemed necessary by the Toms of the world. What explains this paradox? We can find a compelling answer in a widely disseminated article published in 2013 by an academic further along in her career and far more accomplished than I, Radhika Nagpal, the Fred Kavli Professor of Computer Science at Harvard University. Nagpal opens the article by claiming that much of the stress suffered by tenure-track professors is self-imposed. Scary myths and scary data abound about life as a tenure-track faculty at an R1 research-focused university, she begins, before continuing to explain how she finally decided to disregard the conventional wisdom and instead deliberately do specific things to preserve my happiness. This deliberate effort led Nagpal to enjoy her pre-tenure time tremendously. Nagpal goes on to detail several examples of these efforts, but there's one tactic in particular that should sound familiar. As Nagpal admits, early in her academic career, she found herself trying to cram work into every free hour between 7 a.m. and midnight. Because she has kids, this time, especially in the evening, was often severely fractured. It didn't take long before she decided this strategy was unsustainable. So, she set a limit of 50 hours a week and worked backward to determine what rules and habits were needed to satisfy this constraint. Nagpal, in other words, deployed fixed schedule productivity. We know this strategy didn't hurt her academic career, as she ended up earning tenure on schedule and then jumping to the full professor level after only 3 additional years, an impressive ascent. How did she pull this off? According to her article, one of the main techniques for respecting her hour limit was to set drastic quotas on the major sources of shallow endeavors in her academic life. For example, she decided she would travel only 5 times per year for any purpose, as trips can generate a surprisingly large load of urgent, shallow obligations, from making lodging arrangements to writing talks. 5 trips a year may still sound like a lot, but for an academic, it's light. To emphasize this point, note that Matt Welsh, a former colleague of Nagpal in the Harvard Computer Science Department, he now works for Google, once wrote a blog post in which he claimed it was typical for junior faculty to travel 12 to 24 times a year. Imagine the shallow efforts Nagpal avoided in sidestepping an extra 10 to 15 trips. The travel quota is just one of several tactics that Nagpal used to control her workday. She also, for example, placed limits on the number of papers she would review per year. But what all her tactics shared was a commitment to ruthlessly capping the shallow while protecting the deep efforts, that is, original research, that ultimately determined her professional fate. Returning to my own example, it's a similar commitment that enables me to succeed with fixed scheduling. I, too, am incredibly cautious about my use of the most dangerous word in one's productivity vocabulary: yes. It takes a lot to convince me to agree to something that yields shallow work. If you ask for my involvement in university business that's not absolutely necessary, I might respond with the defense I learned from the department chair who hired me. Talk to me after tenure. Another tactic that works well for me is to be clear in my refusal, but ambiguous in my explanation for the refusal. The key is to avoid providing enough specificity about the excuse that the requester has the opportunity to diffuse it. If, for example, I turn down a time-consuming speaking invitation with the excuse that I have other trips scheduled for around the same time, I don't provide details, which might leave the requester the ability to suggest a way to fit his or her event into my existing obligations, but instead just say, "Sounds interesting, but I can't make it due to schedule conflicts." In turning down obligations, I also resist the urge to offer a consolation prize that ends up devouring almost as much of my schedule, e.g., "Sorry I can't join your committee, but I'm happy to take a look at some of your proposals as they come together and offer my thoughts." A clean break is best. In addition to carefully guarding my obligations, I'm incredibly conscientious about managing my time. Because my time is limited each day, I cannot afford to allow a large deadline to creep up on me, or a morning to be wasted on something trivial, because I didn't take a moment to craft a smart plan. The Damoclean cap on the workday enforced by fixed schedule productivity has a way of keeping my organization efforts sharp. Without this looming cutoff, I'd likely end up more lax in my habits. To summarize these observations, Nagpal and I can both succeed in academia without Tom-style overload due to two reasons. First, we're asymmetric in the culling forced by our fixed schedule commitment. By ruthlessly reducing the shallow while preserving the depth, this strategy frees up our time without diminishing the amount of new value we generate. Indeed, I would go so far as to argue that the reduction in shallow frees up more energy for the deep alternative, allowing us to produce more than if we had defaulted to a more typical crowded schedule. Second, the limits to our time necessitate more careful thinking about our organizational habits, also leading to more value produced as compared to longer but less organized schedules. The key claim of this strategy is that these same benefits hold for most knowledge work fields. That is, even if you're not a professor, fixed schedule productivity can yield powerful benefits. In most knowledge work jobs, it can be difficult in the moment to turn down a shallow commitment that seems harmless in isolation, be it accepting an invitation to get coffee or agreeing to jump on a call. A commitment to fixed schedule productivity, however, shifts you into a scarcity mindset. Suddenly, an obligation beyond your deepest efforts is suspect and seen as potentially disruptive. Your default answer becomes no. The bar for gaining access to your time and attention rises precipitously, and you begin to organize the efforts that pass these obstacles with a ruthless efficiency. It might also lead you to test assumptions about your company's work culture that you thought were ironclad but turn out to be malleable. It's common, for example, to receive emails from your boss after hours. Fixed schedule productivity would have you ignore these messages until the next morning. Many suspect that this would cause problems, as such responses are expected. But in many cases, the fact that your boss happens to be clearing her inbox at night doesn't mean that she expects an immediate response. A lesson this strategy would soon help you discover. Fixed schedule productivity, in other words, is a meta-habit that's simple to adopt, but broad in its impact. If you have to choose just one behavior that reorients your focus toward the deep, this one should be high on your list of possibilities. If you're still not sure, however, about the idea that artificial limits on your workday can make you more successful, I urge you to once again turn your attention to the career of fixed schedule advocate Radhika Nagpal. In a satisfying coincidence, at almost the exact same time that Tom was lamenting online about his unavoidably intense workload as a young professor, Nagpal was celebrating the latest of the many professional triumphs she has experienced despite her fixed schedule. Her research was featured on the cover of the journal Science. Become hard to reach. No discussion of shallow work is complete without considering email. This quintessential shallow activity is particularly insidious in its grip on most knowledge workers' attention, as it delivers a steady stream of distractions addressed specifically to you. Ubiquitous email access has become so ingrained in our professional habits that we're beginning to lose the sense that we have any say in its role in our life. As John Freeman warns in his 2009 book, The Tyranny of Email, with the rise of this technology, We are slowly eroding our ability to explain, in a careful, complex way, why it is so wrong for us to complain, resist, or redesign our workdays so that they are manageable. Email seems a fait accompli. Resistance is futile. This strategy pushes back at this fatalism. Just because you cannot avoid this tool altogether doesn't mean you have to cede all authority over its role in your mental landscape. In the following sections, I describe 3 tips that will help you regain authority over how this technology accesses your time and attention, and arrest the erosion of autonomy identified by Freeman. Resistance is not futile. You have more control over your electronic communication than you might at first assume. Tip number 1. Make people who send you email do more work. Most nonfiction authors are easy to reach. They include an email address on their author websites, along with an open invitation to send them any request or suggestion that comes to mind. Many even encourage this feedback as a necessary commitment to the elusive but much touted importance of community building among their readers. But here's the thing, I don't buy it. If you visit the contact page on my author website, there's no general-purpose email address. Instead, I list different individuals you can contact for specific purposes. My literary agent for rights requests, for example, or my speaking agent for speaking requests. If you want to reach me, I offer only a special-purpose email address that comes with conditions and a lowered expectation that I'll respond. If you have an offer, opportunity, or introduction that might make my life more interesting, email me at interesting@calnewport.com. For the reasons stated above, I'll only respond to those proposals that are a good match for my schedule and interests. I call this approach a sender filter, as I'm asking my correspondents to filter themselves before attempting to contact me. This filter has significantly reduced the time I spend in my inbox. Before I began using a sender filter, I had a standard general-purpose email address listed on my website. Not surprisingly, I used to receive a large volume of long emails asking for advice on specific and often quite complicated student or career questions. I like to help individuals, but these requests became overwhelming. They didn't take the senders long to craft, but they would require a lot of explanation and writing on my part to respond. My sender filter has eliminated most such communication, and in doing so, has drastically reduced the number of messages I encounter in my writing inbox. As for my own interest in helping my readers, I now redirect this energy towards settings I carefully choose to maximize impact. Instead of allowing any student in the world to send me a question, for example, I now work closely with a small number of student groups where I'm quite accessible and can offer more substantial and effective mentoring. Another benefit of a sender filter is that it resets expectations. The most crucial line in my description is the following: I'll only respond to those proposals that are a good match for my schedule and interests. This seems minor, but it makes a substantial difference in how my correspondents think about their messages to me. The default social convention surrounding email is that unless you're famous, if someone sends you something, you owe him or her a response. For most, therefore, an inbox full of messages generates a major sense of obligation. By instead resetting your correspondent's expectations to the reality that you'll probably not respond, the experience is transformed. The inbox is now a collection of opportunities that you can glance at when you have the free time, seeking out those that make sense for you to engage. but the pile of unread messages no longer generates a sense of obligation. You could, if you wanted to, ignore them all, and nothing bad would happen. Psychologically, this can be freeing. I worried when I first began using a sender filter that it would seem pretentious, as if my time was more valuable than that of my readers, and that it would upset people. But this fear wasn't realized. Most people easily accept the idea that you have a right to control your own incoming communication, as they would like to enjoy this same right. More important, people appreciate clarity. Most are okay to not receive a response if they don't expect one. In general, those with a minor public presence, such as authors, overestimate how much people really care about your replies to their messages. In some cases, this expectation reset might even earn you more credit when you do respond. For example, an editor of an online publication once sent me a guest post opportunity with the assumption, set by my filter, that I would likely not respond. When I did, it proved a happy surprise. Here's her summary of the interaction. So when I emailed Cal to ask if he wanted to contribute to the publication, my expectations were set. He didn't have anything on his sender filter about wanting to guest blog, so there wouldn't have been any hard feelings if I'd never heard a peep. Then when he did respond, I was thrilled. My particular sender filter is just one example of this general strategy. Consider consultant Clay Herbert, who is an expert in running crowdfunding campaigns for technology startups, a specialty that attracts a lot of correspondents hoping to glean some helpful advice. As a Forbes.com article on sender filters reports, at some point, the number of people reaching out exceeded Herbert's capacity, so he created filters that put the onus on the person asking for help. Though he started from a similar motivation as me, Herbert's filters ended up taking a different form. To contact him, you must first consult an FAQ to make sure your question has not already been answered, which was the case for a lot of the messages Herbert was processing before his filters were in place. If you make it through this FAQ sieve, he then asks you to fill out a survey that allows him to further screen for connections that seem particularly relevant to his expertise. For those who make it past this step, Herbert enforces a small fee you must pay before communicating with him. This fee is not about making extra money, but is instead about selecting individuals who are serious about receiving and acting on advice. Herbert's filters still enable him to help people and encounter interesting opportunities, but at the same time, they have reduced his incoming communication to a level he can easily handle. To give another example, consider Antonio Centeno, who runs the popular Real Man Style blog. Centeno's sender filter lays out a two-step process. If you have a question, he diverts you to a public location to post it. Centeno thinks it's wasteful to answer the same questions again and again in private one-on-one conversations. If you make it past this step, he then makes you commit to, by clicking checkboxes, the following 3 promises. I am not asking Antonio a style question I could find searching Google for 10 minutes. I am not spamming Antonio with a cut and pasting generic request to promote my unrelated business. I will do a good deed for some random stranger if Antonio responds within 23 hours. The message box in which you can type your message doesn't appear on the contact page until after you've clicked the box by all 3 promises. To summarize, the technologies underlying email are transformative, but the current social conventions guiding how we apply this technology are underdeveloped. The notion that all messages, regardless of purpose or sender, arrive in the same undifferentiated inbox and that there's an expectation that every message deserves a timely response is absurdly unproductive. The sender filter is a small but useful step toward a better state of affairs, and is an idea whose time has come, at least for the increasing number of entrepreneurs and freelancers who both receive a lot of incoming communication and have the ability to dictate their accessibility. I'd also love to see similar rules become ubiquitous for intra-office communication in large organizations, but for the reasons argued in Chapter 2, we're probably a long way from that reality. If you're in a position to do so, consider sender filters as a way of reclaiming some control over your time and attention. Tip number 2. Do more work when you send or reply to emails. Consider the following standard emails. Email number 1. It was great to meet you last week. I'd love to follow up on some of those issues we discussed. Do you want to grab coffee? Email number 2. We should get back to the research problem we discussed during my last visit. Remind me where we are with that? Email number 3. I took a stab at that article we discussed. It's attached. Thoughts? These 3 examples should be familiar to most knowledge workers, as they're representative of many of the messages that fill their inboxes. They're also potential productivity landmines. How you respond to them will have a significant impact on how much time and attention the resulting conversation ultimately consumes. In particular, interrogative emails like these generate an initial instinct to dash off the quickest possible response that will clear the message, temporarily, out of your inbox. A quick response will, in the short term, provide you with some minor relief, because you're bouncing the responsibility implied by the message off your court and back onto the senders. This relief, however, is short-lived, as this responsibility will continue to bounce back again and again, continually sapping your time and attention. I suggest, therefore, that the right strategy when faced with a question of this type is to pause a moment before replying and take the time to answer the following key prompt. What is the project represented by this message? And what is the most efficient in terms of messages generated process for bringing this project to a successful conclusion? Once you've answered this question for yourself, replace a quick response with one that takes the time to describe the process you identified, points out the current step, and emphasizes the step that comes next. I call this the process-centric approach to email, and it's designed to minimize both the number of emails you receive and the amount of mental clutter they generate. To better explain this process and why it works, consider the following process-centric responses to the sample emails from earlier. Process-centric response to email number 1. I'd love to grab coffee. Let's meet at the Starbucks on campus. Below, I listed 2 days next week when I'm free. For each day, I listed 3 times. If any of those day and time combinations work for you, let me know. I'll consider your reply confirmation for the meeting. If none of those date and time combinations work, give me a call at the number below and we'll hash out a time that works. Looking forward to it. Process-centric response to email number 2. I agree that we should return to this problem. Here's what I suggest. Sometime in the next week, email me everything you remember about our discussion on the problem. Once I receive that message, I'll start a shared directory for the project and add it to a document that summarizes what you sent me, combined with my own memory of our past discussion. In the document, I'll highlight the 2 or 3 most promising next steps. We can then take a crack at those next steps for a few weeks and check back in. I suggest we schedule a phone call for a month from now for this purpose. Below, I listed some dates and times when I'm available for a call. When you respond with your notes, indicate the date and time combination that works best for you, and we'll consider that reply confirmation for the call. I look forward to digging into this problem. Process-centric response to email number 3. Thanks for getting back to me. I'm going to read this draft of the article and send you back an edited version annotated with comments on Friday, the 10th. In this version I send back, I'll edit what I can do myself and add comments to draw your attention to places where I think you're better suited to make the improvement. At that point, you should have what you need to polish and submit the final draft, so I'll leave you to do that. No need to reply to this message or to follow up with me after I return the edits, unless, of course, there's an issue. In crafting these sample responses, I started by identifying the project implied by the message. Notice the word project is used loosely here. It can cover things that are large and obviously projects, such as making progress on a research problem, example number 2, but it applies just as easily to small logistical challenges like setting up a coffee meeting, example number 1. I then took a minute or two to think through a process that gets us from the current state to a desired outcome with a minimum of messages required. The final step was to write a reply that clearly describes this process and where we stand. These examples centered on an email reply, but it should be clear that a similar approach also works when writing an email message from scratch. The process-centric approach to email can significantly mitigate the impact of this technology on your time and attention. There are 2 reasons for this effect. First, it reduces the number of emails in your inbox. Sometimes significantly, something as simple as scheduling a coffee meeting can easily spiral into a half a dozen or more messages over a period of many days if you're not careful about your replies. This, in turn, reduces the time you spend in your inbox and reduces the brain power you must expend when you do. Second, to steal terminology from David Allen, a good process-centric message immediately closes the loop with respect to the project at hand. When a project is initiated by an email that you send or receive, it squats in your mental landscape, becoming something that's on your plate in the sense that it has been brought to your attention and eventually needs to be addressed. This method closes this open loop as soon as it forms. By working through the whole process, adding to your task lists and calendar any relevant commitments on your part, and bringing the other party up to speed, your mind can reclaim the mental real estate the project once demanded. Less mental clutter means more mental resources available for deep thinking. Process-centric emails might not seem natural at first. For one thing, they require that you spend more time thinking about your messages before you compose them. In the moment, this might seem like you're spending more time on email, but the important point to remember is that the extra 2 to 3 minutes you spend at this point will save you many more minutes reading and responding to unnecessary extra messages later. The other issue is that process-centric messages can seem stilted and overly technical. The current social conventions surrounding email promote a conversational tone that clashes with the more systematic schedules or decision trees commonly used in process-centric communication. If this concerns you, I suggest that you add a longer conversational preamble to your messages. You can even separate the process-centric portion of the message from the conversational opening with a divider line, or label it Proposed Next Steps, so that its technical tone seems more appropriate in context. In the end, these minor hassles are worth it. By putting more thought up front into what's really being proposed by the email messages that flit in and out of your inbox, you'll greatly reduce the negative impact of this technology on your ability to do work that actually matters. Tip number 3, don't respond. As a graduate student at MIT, I had the opportunity to interact with famous academics. In doing so, I noticed that many shared a fascinating and somewhat rare approach to email. Their default behavior when receiving an email message is to not respond. Over time, I learned the philosophy driving this behavior. When it comes to email, they believed, it's the sender's responsibility to convince the receiver that a reply is worthwhile. If you didn't make a convincing case and sufficiently minimize the effort required by the professor to respond, you didn't get a response. For example, the following email would likely not generate a reply with many of the famous names at the Institute. Hi, Professor. I'd love to stop by sometime to talk about topic X. Are you available? Responding to this message requires too much work. Are you available is too vague to be answered quickly. Also, there's no attempt to argue that this chat is worth the professor's time. With these critiques in mind, here's a version of the same message that would be more likely to generate a reply. Hi, Professor. I'm working on a project similar to Topic X with my advisor, Professor Y. Is it okay if I stop by in the last 15 minutes of your office hours on Thursday to explain what we're up to in more detail and see if it might complement your current project? Unlike the first message, this one makes a clear case for why this meeting makes sense and minimizes the effort needed from the receiver to respond. This tip asks that you replicate, to the extent feasible in your professional context, this professional ambivalence to email. To help you in this effort, try applying the following 3 rules to sort through which messages require a response and which do not. Professorial email sorting. Do not reply to an email message if any of the following applies. It's ambiguous or otherwise makes it hard for you to generate a reasonable response. It's not a question or proposal that interests you. Nothing really good would happen if you did respond, and nothing really bad would happen if you didn't. In all cases, there are many obvious exceptions. If an ambiguous message about a project you don't care about comes from your company's CEO, for example, you'll respond. But looking beyond these exceptions, this professorial approach asks you to become way more ruthless when deciding whether or not to click reply. This tip can be uncomfortable at first because it will cause you to break a key convention currently surrounding email. Replies are assumed, regardless of the relevance or appropriateness of the message. There's also no way to avoid that some bad things will happen if you take this approach. At the minimum, some people might get confused or upset, especially if they've never seen standard email conventions questioned or ignored. Here's the thing. This is okay. As the author Tim Ferriss once wrote, develop the habit of letting small bad things happen. If you don't, you'll never find time for the life-changing big things. It should comfort you to realize that, as the professors at MIT discovered, people are quick to adjust their expectations to the specifics of your communication habits. The fact that you didn't respond to their hastily scribed messages is probably not a central event in their lives. Once you get past the discomfort of this approach, you'll begin to experience its rewards. There are two common tropes bandied around when people discuss solutions to email overload. One says that sending emails generates more emails, while the other says that wrestling with ambiguous or irrelevant emails is a major source of inbox-related stress. The approach suggested here responds aggressively to both issues. You send fewer emails and ignore those that aren't easy to process, and by doing so, will significantly weaken the grip your inbox maintains over your time and attention.